Welcome to the Abundant Vision Fundraising Podcast. Whether you are a seasoned professional or a first-time fundraiser, we have the advice you need to take your next step toward major gift mastery. I'm your host, Tom Dauber, President of Abundant Vision Philanthropic Consulting. Well, this is a great pleasure. Today, I have the privilege of having Jason Lewis here with me, of Responsive Fundraising, as well as the Butterfly Effect. Jason, I've been following you on LinkedIn for quite some time. So delighted to have you on. Thank you for agreeing to be part of the show.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here too. And I probably hear that periodically, that folks have been following me around a little bit on LinkedIn, or my opinions on working out my opinions on Substack or something like that. So I'm glad to take the conversation to another level.
Absolutely. Well, the origins of this conversation really started the last month or so. We were chatting. You were sharing about some things you're doing with a consulting group. And then we got onto the topic of the gift and what that is, and gift theory and all those sorts of things. And anyway, I appreciate you coming on the show to talk about gift theory. And we've got a lot of folks that listen to the show that are new to the profession, or maybe folks that have moved into the nonprofit world from other roles or for other reasons. And this was going to be really helpful for them. But before we get into all that sort of stuff, tell us a little bit about your fundraiser origin story. How did you find your way into fundraising in the first place? What were you doing before this work became part of your life?
You know, I've spent my whole career in this space. My wife and I, shortly after we married, went to work for a children's home in the southwest corner of Virginia. Both of us had every intention to work with the children, and my wife was pretty good at it, working directly with the kids, but I ended up being more like an older brother who didn't know how to keep them youngsters in line. And so coincidentally, they offered me the fundraising position. They helped me join the local Rotary Club. They got me a lot of training with an organization called the Christian Stewardship Association. I don't think that organization doesn't exist anymore. And fundraising, I'm like a lot of us, I came through the back door. So, and I was also stumbling my way through college. I was still, my wife and I met and married before we finished college. And so I was finishing college at the time. And so fundraising was new, and it seemed to fit. So it stuck.
That's awesome. Now, did you grow up in the South? Where were you from originally?
My dad was U.S. Coast Guard, so we moved around quite a bit. I graduated high school, Thomas, in Astoria, Oregon, of all places. Met my wife in Savannah, which is where we were earlier in high school. My parents retired in South Georgia. Dad had 2 assignments in Mobile, so we did plenty of if you listen to me long enough, you'll hear that Southern drawl in there. But that's not because I grew up, exclusively in the South. It's just because the Coast Guard had a tendency to be very coastal. And so, either on the Atlantic or the Gulf. And Dad had a number of assignments on the West Coast as well growing up. So, yeah, so I've kind of been around. The only place, you're up in Michigan, right?
Ohio.
Ohio. Yeah. So that's the one part of there's certain parts of the country that don't open up to a big giant water source, and so those are the parts of the country that I'm not as familiar with.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Well, before we jump in further, when you're not fundraising, when you're not consulting, when you're not teaching, all the things that you do, what do you actually do with your free time? What helps you disconnect and recharge?
Yeah, so we've lived in York, Pennsylvania, Thomas, for 18 years. My younger daughter will be 18 this year. We moved here right around the time she was born. And we have been fans of the York Revolution, which is a small independent team, a team in an independent league. So these aren't the teams that make it. This is outside the farm system, right?
Are we talking baseball?
Yeah, baseball. Yeah. So that's what we do. I'm answering your question about, what do I enjoy doing when I'm not consulting and not teaching? Usually I spend baseball season will start here in about another 4 to 6 weeks, and we'll spend 6 months at the ballpark.
Wow. Is this one of those teams that plays the Savannah Bananas and all that sort of thing?
No, the Savannah Bananas, well, I think they're part of an independent arrangement too.
Yeah.
They're not part of the farm system, and they're not part of the we have about, with what's called the Mid-Atlantic League. It's a league of about 12 or 15 teams in and around Mid-Atlantic. But those guys, I suspect, if they're part of an official league, are perhaps part of a team in the South, in the Southeast. But it's funny you mentioned the when I was in high school in Savannah, they were the team that actually played at that stadium was the Cardinals, and then they became the Sand Gnats, and then they became the Bananas. So I've been in that stadium where those guys play quite a bit back in my high school and college years. So,
that's awesome.
A little bit of history there with that team. A lot of folks don't know that team has some history, that before they were Bananas, they were Cardinals and Sand Gnats.
Well, it seems like that rebrand has worked well for them.
It's worked for them. Yes, it has. It definitely seems to have worked for them. And being as fond of Savannah as my wife and I are, I'm embarrassed to say that we haven't gotten back down there to see a game. But if we were in the area, we'd certainly go.
There's an interesting segue here, Jason. The Savannah Bananas, they changed their approach to the way they were doing baseball, and they've had a lot of success. And I think today we're going to talk a little bit about how different approaches in fundraising can really transform work as well, right?
Yeah, we're going to try.
That's the hope.
I'll be gentle.
I appreciate it. So, like I mentioned before, we were just having a simple conversation about gift theory.
Yeah.
And to my surprise, I've actually never heard of gift theory before.
Right.
Now, I think I know why. I think I've been doing a little more reading, a little more thinking. I think I've been exposed to some of this stuff, but just not with the same terminology.
Yeah.
But I'm sure that 100% of my listeners, unless they follow you, probably have not heard of it.
Yeah.
Tell us what gift theory is and why it should matter in our work.
So most of us, the first place most of us are going to encounter gift theory, which is just basically the theoretical frameworks, the way we think around gifts differently than like we think about commodities or taxes, any kind of finance. The first place, Thomas, that most of us would encounter that would have been if we took a sociology class or like an anthropology class in college. That would have been the first place we would have encountered it. And we would have, our sociology or anthropology professor might have referenced something called modes of exchange. And modes of exchange is just this notion that, or this recognition that throughout all of human history, going all the way back to the most primitive forms of, all the way back to when human beings were organizing essentially society, they essentially had three different modes of exchanging goods and services and relating to one another. And we've done that through gifts, or gift through like an economy that's sort of centered around gifts. We've had economies that are very centered around something that looks like taxes, or things that look like taxes. And then like what we're all very familiar with in this very present day world, very centered around commodities. So, when we talk about, when you or I or our colleagues talk about being in a very capitalistic or market-driven society, we're talking about that commodity-driven sort of way of, and what the sociologist or anthropology professor would have been trying to get us to understand is that there's been moments in time, just even in some cases, just going back a couple hundred years, there have been places where that role of the market and the commodity hasn't been as strong or central to the way that we, organize ourselves. Yeah.
Tell me, so I'm,
what's the usefulness of this? Where does this
break this down? So what does that mean for the executive director at a small $1 million budget nonprofit?
It doesn't mean much of anything for the executive director at the small mom and pop rescue mission or charity.
Yeah.
The idea that this guy wants to talk about this notion of gift that doesn't probably make a lot of sense. I think those it makes probably the most sense to at least give it some credence and to sort of ponder it are those of us who've been in the fundraising space long enough to know that we've got lots of issues. We've got lots of things we like to complain about, talk about how things don't go right. I shared with you when you and I first met, I said I hosted a podcast for 5 years and I hosted fundraisers like you and I are doing this here today. And I listened for 5 years to fundraisers tell me all the rights and wrongs and all the different ways that we should fix everything that perhaps isn't so right about this thing that we call the fundraising profession. And what's interesting, what I started to pick up on, sort of almost rather coincidentally, not really necessarily looking for it, is I started to realize that the one thing in the whole sort of kit and caboodle when we talk about what fundraising is all about, the one thing that fundraisers never really sort of seem to want to talk about is the gift itself and whether the logic of the gift or this notion of gift theory has any utility, has any value in terms of answering some of our questions and setting the expectations for how these relationships work, or,
Well, and we've got a lot of ground to cover, but just to set the table, here are the dots I think I'm connecting. So
as
gift
a newcomer,
mode,
you're a newcomer to gift.
I am, right.
Yes,
so we're learning together.
Give your listeners Thomas is a newcomer to gift theory.
So gift mode's about mutuality, right?
Yeah, so the one author that I shared with you, she's a sociologist, historian at Princeton, and she takes this, she would sort of be in this category of folks who understand. She wouldn't describe herself as a gift theorist, but Natalie Zimmon Davis is she uses this term gift mode, sales mode, and coercive mode, and these are modes of relating. Which is the language, so it's taking this notion of gift theory and it's saying that we can relate to one another as if we're organized around sales or taxes or coercion, or we can organize relationships around the notion of a gift. And most of us are pretty familiar with that when we think about Christmas time. That we understand how the gift sort of organizes things. But I oftentimes say that the gift, if you were involved, for example, growing up in a local church is essentially a gift economy in many ways. So we don't really pass around, commodity exchange doesn't really work inside the local church, and we don't generally collect taxes inside the local church. And so that's probably the most familiar that a lot of us would have with a gift economy. Sure. And needs do get met. I mean, if you and I think about our involvement perhaps in a local church or religious organization, needs do get met, and we don't use prices. There's no price. Nobody has to be, there's no kings or queens, setting tax rates, and yet the economy in a local church tends to work.
Yeah. The thing, when I think about gift mode or mutuality, it strikes me that it's based on mutual recognition and trust.
Yeah.
We're focused on relationship, belonging, and shared meaning.
Yeah.
I've got that right. And the participation's voluntary, relational, rather than transactional or compelled. When I put those things together and I think about them like that, what comes to mind is training that I got years ago on donor-centered fundraising.
Yeah, sure.
And so initially when I came across this, it was compelling and interesting to begin with, but I'm like, boy, this is so foreign. Why is it so foreign? And when I began to think about it like that, it began to connect some dots like, okay, I agree with everything Jason is saying about giving, but yet I've not heard about it in this way. I think a lot of the thrust of this does relate to a lot of those trainings that are out there about fundraising from a donor-centered perspective, or even some of maybe Julie Emlin's work around stewardship, potentially. I don't know. Does that sound right to you, Jason?
Maybe halfway. The gift.
I'll take it.
Yeah, I'll give you maybe half of that. So the more you understand the way that a gift works, a gift is supposed to work both ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's supposed
Yeah.
to work both ways.
Yeah.
And so at any given time, in a gift economy or in a gift relationship, you and I would not play the role of a donor or a giver and a receipt. We would not play those roles in isolation. You know, there would be times when I would be equally on the receiving or giving end as the other. And so when I look at donor-centered fundraising, I say, okay, I see an individual who's giving, but I don't necessarily see how it translates into receiving. So if you work that out, and I'm sure there's plenty of examples of folks who would be very true to donor-centered thinking that would say there are ways that we. The other thing is I think we tend to lose some of the obligation. The gift is there not to be about the transaction or the amount that is being exchanged. It's there to form a relationship. It's there to actually form this bond. Most people who write about the gift, and they're making reference to kind of where we're at here, would talk about almost like it's glue, like it's an adhesive that sort of sticks us together.
Okay.
When I look, 4 out of 5 first-time donors don't renew. Something in it, no matter how much you sprinkle donor-centered language on it or something else, something's not clicking. They don't understand, or we don't understand, or something's getting, because I think there ought to be some sense of obligation that says, okay, once we enter into this relationship, we're in this for the long haul. I don't think donor retention should be as hard as it is. And I think it's because we've let the donor off the hook using more of a commodity consumer-like logic that says, you know, if the donor wants to walk into Walmart and buy something but wants to shop over at Target next week, that's okay. I don't buy that when I think of the gift. The gift relationship is more, it's more sticky. Yeah.
So you shared with me an article from your Substack called The Moral Architecture of the Gift. What was happening in the nonprofit world? What are you seeing presently that made you feel like you needed to write about this? And
when I launched that podcast 6 or 7 years ago, I had written a small book, and I had written a book in response to what I thought were some of the overriding challenges that our sector or the fundraising community was being confronted with. And then subsequent to that book coming out and listening to all these conversations, I started to just sort of I was sort of forced into making sense of all these other things that maybe we haven't gotten right. And articles like the one you're referencing, I started to do my homework on how did the fundraising profession evolve over time. And if you look at the fundraising profession, it evolved throughout the 20th century. The people that we would sort of credit as being sort of the earliest, sort of the pioneers in our space, very late 19th, early 20th century folks who are trying to make sense of what it is we're trying to do in a rapidly growing and expanding consumer economy. And instead of picking up the logic of like the gift, we just did a lot of borrowing of the logic of the commodity. And so you see one of the things I was hearing on that fast track to the podcast, and I'm listening to these fundraisers, one of the number one complaints that I heard, Thomas, was fundraising is so transactional. I just heard it. Every couple of we would be having conversations not unlike this one, and they just kept saying fundraising is so transactional. I've already picked on the donor retention rates, but here we are, this profession that's evolved, sort of become quite a legitimate career path in the last couple of decades. But at the same time, we keep seeing these reports that, whereas 20 or 25 years ago, 2/3 of Americans were giving, now we're less than half. So, what is it we're doing? And I'm just saying, hey, maybe we just grabbed the wrong toolbox or the wrong sets of tools, or maybe we drew some conclusions about who the donor is. And it's consequently led us to where we find ourselves today.
That's all the time we have today. But be sure to tune in next week to hear the next part of this exciting conversation. Now, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating on your podcast provider. I'm your host, Tom Dauber. Thank you for joining me as we journey together towards major gift mastery on the Abundant Vision Fundraising Podcast.